The crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek as Katherine Miller ducked behind a water trough, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild Mustang. It was 1878 in the Arizona Territory, and she had fled nearly 2,000 miles to escape the shadows of her past, only to find they had followed her all the way from Boston. Catherine Kate, to the few who had earned the right, pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the blistering heat. The sound of boots scraping against dirt grew closer, and she held her breath, praying that whoever was causing the commotion would pass by without noticing her. The last thing she needed was more trouble. She already had enough hiding from Vernon, the husband she'd escaped 3 weeks ago. "You can't hide forever, McGinty," a gruff voice called out. "The boss wants his money, and I aim to collect." Another shot rang out, followed by the splintering of wood. Kate flinched, pressing herself harder against the rough-hewn boards of the trough. Water sloshed over the edge, dampening her already dusty skirts. "I don't have it yet," another voice replied. "Tell Blackburn I'll get his money by the end of the week." The confrontation moved further down the street, and Kate slowly released her breath. Life in Redemption Creek was proving to be just as dangerous as Boston, only the dangers were more honest here. Back east, the worst threats had worn fine suits and smiled at church gatherings. Here, at least men carried their intentions openly on their hips, holstered in leather. When the street quieted, Kate rose carefully and brushed the dust from her skirts. She needed to get to her job at the Silver Dollar Saloon before Mrs. Rhodes docked her pay again. The older woman had taken a chance hiring Kate as a serving girl despite her lack of references, and Kate couldn't afford to lose the position. Not when she was still saving for a ticket further west to California, where Vernon would never find her. She hurried down the wooden sidewalk, keeping her head low as she passed the various storefronts. Redemption Creek had grown from a mining camp to a proper town over the past decade, though it still retained its rough edges. The general store, the blacksmith, the assayer's office all buzzing with activity as the town prepared for the cattle drives that would soon be passing through. The Silver Dollar stood at the far end of the main street, its swinging doors already propped open to catch whatever breeze might wander by in the oppressive heat. Kate slipped in through the side entrance, hoping to avoid the watchful eye of Mrs. Rhodes. "You're late, girl," the older woman called from behind the bar, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Rhodes. There was trouble on the street." The woman snorted. "There's always trouble on the street. That's why you should leave earlier." Her expression softened slightly as she took in Kate's appearance. "You look peaked. Get yourself a glass of water before you start." Kate nodded gratefully and moved to the small kitchen at the back of the saloon. As she filled a tin cup from the water barrel, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror hanging on the wall. The bruise on her cheekbone had darkened to a deep purple, and no amount of rice powder seemed to cover it completely, Vernon's parting gift. She touched it gingerly, wincing at the tenderness that remained even weeks later. The bruises on her arms had faded to a sickly yellow, but this one persisted, a reminder of why she had run. She quickly patted more powder onto her face, careful to blend it as best she could. Mrs. Rhodes had asked no questions when Kate had arrived in town with a battered face, and Kate had offered no explanations. In Redemption Creek, folks tended to mind their own business. It was one of the things she appreciated most about the West. "Kate, table 3 needs tending," Mrs. Rhodes called. Kate tied on her apron and hurried back into the main room. The saloon was beginning to fill with the usual afternoon crowd, miners coming off shift, cowboys passing through, and the occasional businessman looking to escape the heat with a cold beer. She moved efficiently between tables, taking orders and delivering drinks, keeping her eyes downcast to avoid unwanted attention. Just after sunset, when the oil lamps had been lit and the piano player had taken his place in the corner, the doors of the Silver Dollar swung open and a tall figure stepped inside. The usual chatter quieted for a moment as the newcomer surveyed the room, then resumed at a slightly lower pitch. Kate was wiping down the bar when Mrs. Rhodes nudged her. "Table by the window," she said quietly. "New face in town. Best see what he wants." Kate glanced over and saw a man settling into a chair, his back to the wall and his face partially shadowed by the brim of his hat. His posture was relaxed but alert, like a mountain lion resting but ready to spring at any moment. A cowboy by the look of him, trail-worn clothes, dust-covered boots, and a revolver strapped to his hip. Taking a deep breath, Kate made her way over to his table. "What can I get for you, sir?" she asked, keeping her voice steady and her gaze fixed on her order pad. "Whiskey," he replied, his voice deep and tinged with the drawl of Texas. "And whatever you're serving for supper." "Stew and biscuits tonight," Kate said, still not looking directly at him. "That'll do fine." There was a pause, and then, "Madam, I generally like to see who I'm talking to." Reluctantly, Kate raised her eyes to meet his. The cowboy was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a weather-beaten face and eyes the color of a summer storm. His gaze was direct, but not unkind, and something in it made Kate's heart stutter in a way that had nothing to do with fear. His expression changed slightly as he took in her appearance, his eyes lingering for a moment on her cheek, where the powder couldn't quite conceal the bruise. But he said nothing about it, merely nodded. "Thank you, madam." Kate hurried away, unsettled by the encounter. There had been something in his look, not pity, exactly, but a kind of understanding that made her feel exposed. She returned moments later with his whiskey, setting it down carefully before retreating to the safety of the bar. Throughout the evening, she was acutely aware of the cowboy's presence. He ate his stew slowly, occasionally exchanging words with other patrons but mostly keeping to himself. Once or twice, she caught him watching her, his expression thoughtful. As the night wore on, the saloon grew rowdier. A group of cowhands fresh off the trail had arrived, their pockets full of wages and their minds set on spending them. Kate moved cautiously around them, all too familiar with how quickly men's hands could wander after a few drinks. "Hey there, pretty lady," one called as she passed with a tray of empty glasses. "How about joining us for a drink?" "I'm working," Kate replied shortly, trying to step around him. The cowhand moved to block her path. "Ah, come on, just one drink. You look like you could use some fun." "Please let me pass," Kate said, her voice firmer now. She could feel Mrs. Rhodes watching from behind the bar, ready to intervene if necessary, but the older woman generally expected her girls to handle themselves. The man reached out, his fingers brushing against Kate's arm. "Don't be like that." The lady said no. The voice came from behind Kate, calm but carrying a note of steel beneath the surface. The cowboy from the window table had materialized beside her, his stance casual but his eyes hard as flint. He wasn't particularly broad, but something in his bearing suggested he was not a man to be trifled with. The cowhand sized him up, then apparently thought better of pursuing the matter. "Just being friendly," he muttered, stepping aside. The cowboy nodded slightly. "Best keep your friendly to yourself." He turned to Kate. "You all right, madam?" "Yes. Thank you." She was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. He tipped his hat. "Hank Whitaker. Just passing through on my way to the Rocking M." "The Rocking M? That's Maxwell's spread." "Yes, madam." Signed on as his new foreman. His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "I don't usually make a habit of interfering, but it seemed like you might appreciate some assistance." Kate found herself smiling slightly, despite her usual caution around men. "I did. Thank you, Mr. Whitaker." "Just Hank, if you don't mind." A call from across the room drew Kate's attention. "I should get back to work." Hank nodded. "Of course. Good evening, Miss Katherine Miller, but most call me Kate." "Good evening then, Miss Kate." As Kate moved away to attend to her other customers, she felt strangely lighter than she had in months. There had been something reassuring about Hank Whitaker's presence, a quiet strength that didn't feel threatening the way Vernon's forceful personality had. The remainder of the evening passed without incident, and by closing time, most of the patrons had staggered home or found other entertainments. Hank had departed an hour earlier with a polite nod in her direction, leaving Kate with an odd sense of disappointment. "You did well tonight," Mrs. Rhodes said, as they swept the floor after the last customer had left. "That could have gotten ugly with Turner and his boys." "Mr. Whitaker helped," Kate admitted. Mrs. Rhodes gave her a knowing look. "Yes, he did. Seems a decent sort. Not like most of the drifters that come through here." She paused, studying Kate's face. "That bruise is looking better. Another week, and it'll be gone." Kate touched her cheek self-consciously. "I hope so." "Whoever gave it to you," Mrs. Rhodes began. "I don't want to talk about it," Kate said quickly. The older woman nodded. "Fair enough. Just know that not all men are the same, girl. Some know how to treat a woman right." Kate thought of Vernon's charming smile when they'd first met, how it had made her believe he was one of the good ones, how that smile had twisted into something cruel behind closed doors. "I've learned not to trust appearances," she said quietly. Mrs. Rhodes sighed. "Can't blame you for that. But don't close yourself off entirely. Life's too short and too hard out here to face it all alone." Kate said nothing, but as she walked back to her small rented room above the milliner's shop, her thoughts kept returning to the cowboy with the storm-gray eyes and the quiet voice. Hank Whitaker, new foreman at the Rocking M, which lay some 5 miles outside town. She wondered if she would see him again, then chided herself for even considering it. She had no business thinking about any man, not when she was still legally bound to Vernon. The small room was stifling in the summer heat, and Kate opened the window wide, hoping to catch a breeze. As she prepared for bed, she studied her reflection in the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The bruise stood out starkly against her pale skin, a reminder of everything she had fled. She had been the dutiful daughter of a Boston merchant, raised to be a proper lady and make a good match. Vernon Miller, 15 years her senior and a business associate of her father's, had seemed the perfect husband, successful, respected, charming in public. No one would have believed that behind closed doors he transformed into a monster who used his fists to control his young wife. For 2 years, Kate had endured, making excuses for the bruises, believing his promises that it would never happen again. Until the night he had nearly killed her, his rage fueled by whiskey and baseless jealousy. She had fled with nothing but the clothes on her back and the pearl earrings that had been her mother's, which she had sold in St. Louis to buy a ticket west. Now, lying on her narrow bed listening to the distant sounds of the town settling for the night, Kate wondered what would become of her. Vernon would not give up easily. Men like him never did. Sooner or later, he would track her down, and when he did, Kate closed her eyes, refusing to let the fear overwhelm her. One day at a time, she told herself. That was the only way to survive. The following days fell into a pattern. Kate worked her shifts at the Silver Dollar, saved her wages, and kept to herself as much as possible. The bruise on her cheek faded gradually, though she still dusted it with powder out of habit. She saw no more of Hank Whitaker, and told herself it was for the best. Then, a week after their first meeting, he returned to the saloon. It was mid-afternoon, the place nearly empty except for a few regulars playing cards in the corner. Kate was arranging glasses behind the bar when the doors swung open, and Hank stepped inside, removing his hat as he entered. His eyes found her immediately, and he nodded in greeting as he approached the bar. "Miss Kate." "Mr. Whitaker. What can I get you?" "Just some water, if you don't mind. Been writing since dawn." He settled onto a bar stool, placing his hat on the counter beside him. "How have you been?" The simple question, asked with what seemed like genuine interest, caught Kate off guard. "Well enough," she replied cautiously. "And yourself?" "Can't complain. Maxwell runs a good operation, though there's plenty to be done before the big drive next month." Kate filled a glass with water and placed it before him. "I heard the Rocking M lost some cattle to rustlers last season." Hank nodded. "That's part of why I was brought on. Maxwell needs someone who can handle that sort of trouble." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "But I didn't come into town to talk about cattle rustling." Kate raised an eyebrow. "No?" "No." He took a sip of water. "Truth is, I was hoping you might consider joining me for supper at the hotel restaurant tomorrow evening. I understand it's your night off." Kate stared at him, momentarily speechless. It had been so long since anyone had treated her like a woman worthy of courting rather than an object to be possessed or used. That's very kind, but I don't think—" "Just supper," Hank said gently. "Nothing more. And if you'd prefer not to, I'll understand completely, and won't bother you again." There was something in his manner, a respect for her boundaries that Vernon had never shown, that made Kate hesitate. "Why me?" she asked finally. "You hardly know me." Hank considered her question seriously. "Because in the few minutes we spoke last week, I saw something in you that interested me. Strength. Dignity. Despite whatever troubles you've faced." His gaze flickered briefly to her cheek, where the bruise was now barely visible. "And I'd like the chance to know you better, if you're willing." Kate should have said no. She was still married, still in danger, still planning to leave as soon as she had enough money saved. Getting involved with anyone, especially a man, was foolish beyond measure. Yet something inside her, some part that hadn't been completely crushed by Vernon's cruelty, yearned for the simple pleasure of a meal with someone who looked at her with kindness rather than entitlement. "Very well," she heard herself say. "Tomorrow at 7?" Hank's smile was warm but restrained, as if he sensed her wariness and respected it. "7 it is. I'll meet you here, if that suits you." After he left, Kate wondered if she had lost her mind. Mrs. Rhodes, catching her distracted expression, merely smiled knowingly and said, "About time you allowed yourself some company, girl. And he seems a decent sort?" The next evening, Kate found herself taking unusual care with her appearance. She washed her hair and pinned it up in a simple but flattering style, and put on her one good dress, a modest blue calico that had seen better days but was still presentable. At the last moment, she reached for the small pot of powder on her dresser, dabbing it carefully over the faint shadow that remained on her cheek. Hank was waiting outside the saloon as promised, dressed in clean clothes with his hair still damp from washing. He offered his arm with an old-fashioned courtesy that reminded Kate of better times, and they walked together to the hotel at the end of the street. The Redemption Creek Hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in town, which wasn't saying much. But the tables were covered with clean cloths, the silverware polished, and the food several steps above the hearty but simple fare at the saloon. Conversation came more easily than Kate had expected. Hank told her about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, losing his parents to fever when he was 16, and making his way as a cowhand and eventually foreman on various spreads throughout the territory. He spoke without self-pity about the hardships he had faced, and with quiet pride about the skills he had developed. In turn, Kate found herself sharing carefully edited versions of her own past, her childhood in Boston, her love of books, her journey west seeking a new beginning. She said nothing about Vernon and Hank, showing that same intuitive respect for her boundaries, asked no questions that would force her to lie or reveal more than she wished. By the time they finished their apple pie and coffee, Kate realized she had enjoyed herself more than she had in years. There was an ease to Hank's company that made her feel safe, despite all her reasons for caution. "May I walk you home?" he asked as they left the restaurant. Kate hesitated only briefly before nodding. The night air was cool and sweet after the day's heat, and the streets of Redemption Creek were quiet except for the muffled sounds from the saloons and the occasional burst of laughter. They walked slowly, neither seeming eager for the evening to end. When they reached the stairs leading up to Kate's room, Hank stopped, maintaining a respectful distance. "I've enjoyed your company very much, Miss Kate," he said quietly. "As have I, Mr. Whitaker," she replied, surprising herself with her honesty. "Would you permit me to call on you again?" Kate knew she should refuse. Nothing could come of this, not with her past hanging over her like a shadow. But the thought of never seeing him again, of returning to her solitary existence with only her fears for company, was suddenly unbearable. "Yes," she said softly. "I would like that." His smile was worth the risk, she decided. "Good night, then." "Good night, Hank." She watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the distant lights of the saloon, before climbing the stairs to her room. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without fear dogging her dreams. Over the next few weeks, Kate and Hank settled into a cautious courtship. He would ride into town whenever his duties at the ranch permitted, sometimes just for an hour to share a cup of coffee. Other times, for longer visits, they walked together along the creek that gave the town its name, attended the small church on Sundays, and once rode out to a meadow filled with wildflowers where they shared a simple picnic. Through it all, Hank never pressed for more than Kate was willing to give. He seemed content with her company and conversation, and though his eyes sometimes held a warmth that made her pulse quicken, he maintained the boundaries she had established with scrupulous care. Kate began to believe that perhaps she could have this small happiness, at least for a while. Vernon would eventually find her. She had no illusions about that. But until then, why shouldn't she enjoy the simple pleasure of Hank's companionship? Then came the telegram that shattered her fragile peace. She was at the general store, purchasing supplies, when Mr. Peterson called her over to the small postal counter at the back. "Telegram came for you, Miss Miller," he said, holding out a yellow slip of paper. Kate took it with fingers that suddenly felt numb, her heart racing. No one knew she was here. No one except. The message was brief and chilling. "Found you, stop arriving Thursday. Stop your loving husband Vernon, stop." The words swam before her eyes. Thursday. Today was Tuesday. She had less than 2 days before Vernon arrived to reclaim what he considered his property. She stumbled from the store, the telegram clutched in her hand, her mind racing. She had to run again. California, or perhaps north to Oregon. She had almost enough saved. If she left tonight, Kate? She jerked her head up to find Hank watching her with concern, having apparently just ridden into town. One look at her face and he was dismounting, crossing to her side in long strides. "What's wrong?" She opened her mouth to lie, to make some excuse, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she thrust the telegram at him, watching as his expression shifted from concern to understanding and then to something harder. "Your husband," he said quietly, not a question. Kate nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as if against a chill, though the day was warm. "I have to leave. Tonight." Hank studied her face, his gaze lingering on her cheek where the bruise had once been. "Is he the one who hurt you?" Another nod, smaller this time. "He'll kill me if he finds me. I know he will." Hank's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "You don't have to run, Kate." She laughed. A harsh sound with no humor in it. "Of course I do. He's my husband. The law is on his side." "Not if he's hurting you. Not here." Kate shook her head. "You don't understand. Vernon is. He's respected. Wealthy. People listen to him. They believe him." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "No one ever believed me." Hank stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel the steady strength of his presence. "I believe you." 3 simple words, but they nearly undid her. Kate closed her eyes against sudden tears. It doesn't matter. I can't stay. Come with me to the ranch, Hank said suddenly. Just until we figure this out. Maxwell won't mind, and Vernon won't think to look for you there. I can't ask you to get involved in this. You're not asking. I'm offering. His gaze was steady, unwavering. Trust me, Kate. Please. In that moment, with fear clawing at her throat and the walls closing in, Kate made a choice. She nodded once, sharply. All right. But just until I can make arrangements to go further west. Relief crossed Hank's features. Let's get your things. We should leave town before anyone notices. An hour later, Kate was riding behind Hank on his horse, her few belongings packed in a saddlebag, heading toward the rocking M. She had left a note for Mrs. Rhodes explaining her sudden departure, along with her room key and the final week's rent. The ranch lay nestled in a valley between rolling hills, its buildings weathered but well-maintained. Charles Maxwell, the owner, was a gruff widower in his 60s, who asked few questions when Hank explained that Kate needed a safe place to stay for a short while. He showed her to a small but comfortable bedroom in the main house, introduced her to the cook and housekeeper, Mrs. Gunderson, and then left her to settle in. You'll be safe here, Hank assured her before he left to attend to his duties. Maxwell doesn't hold with men who hurt women. Neither do any of the hands. Kate spent the rest of the day helping Mrs. Gunderson in the kitchen, grateful for the distraction of work. The older woman chattered comfortably about the ranch and its inhabitants, requiring little response from Kate beyond the occasional nod or murmur of interest. As evening approached, Kate found herself drawn to the porch, where she sat watching the sun set over the distant mountains. The landscape was so different from the crowded streets of Boston, vast and open, with a wild beauty that spoke to something deep within her. Penny for your thoughts? Hank said quietly, joining her on the porch steps. I was just thinking how peaceful it is here, Kate replied honestly. How free? Hank nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's why I could never go back east. Too many walls, too many rules. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tell me about him, Hank said finally. Your husband. Kate stiffened slightly, but something in Hank's tone not demanding, merely concerned, made her answer. We married when I was 19. He was 34, a business associate of my father's. Everyone thought it was such a good match. Her laugh was bitter. He was charming, respected in the community. No one knew what he was really like. And what was that? Kate stared into the distance, her voice flat. Cruel, controlling. He wanted to own me, not love me. The first time he hit me was 3 weeks after our wedding. I had spoken to a male friend of my family's at church, and Vernon accused me of impropriety. She swallowed hard. He apologized afterward, said it would never happen again. But it did, again and again, until it became normal. Until I began to believe I deserved it. Hank's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained gentle. No one deserves that, Kate. No one. I know that now, but it took me 2 years to find the courage to leave. She turned to look at him directly. And now he's coming to take me back. He'll never let me go, Hank. Men like Vernon don't lose what they consider theirs. You're not his, Hank said firmly. You never were, not really. Kate smiled sadly. The law says otherwise. The law isn't always right. Hank hesitated, then reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he took her hand in his touch warm and reassuring. We'll figure this out, Kate, I promise you. For a moment, sitting there with her hand in his and the vast sky stretching above them, Kate almost believed him. The next day passed in a blur of anxiety. Kate helped Mrs. Gunderson with the cooking and cleaning, trying to keep her mind occupied, but her thoughts kept straying to Vernon. By now, he would be on his way, perhaps already in Redemption Creek asking questions, looking for her. Late in the afternoon, Hank rode in with news. He had sent one of the hands into town to listen for gossip, and the report was troubling. A well-dressed Easterner had indeed arrived, asking about a woman matching Kate's description. He was staying at the hotel and had already spoken to the sheriff, presenting papers proving that Katherine Miller was his lawful wife. "He's telling everyone you're unwell," Hank said grimly, "that you've had episodes of mental disturbance, and that he's deeply concerned for your safety." Kate felt the blood drain from her face. "He's laying the groundwork. When he takes me back, he'll tell everyone any injuries are self-inflicted. That I'm not to be believed." "I won't let that happen," Hank said, his voice hard with determination. Kate shook her head. "You don't understand what he's capable of. Vernon will stop at nothing." "Neither will I," Hank interrupted. "Not when it comes to protecting you." The conviction in his voice made her throat tighten with emotion. No one had ever stood up for her against Vernon before. No one had ever thought she was worth the risk. That evening, after a tense supper during which Maxwell and Hank discussed strategies for keeping Kate safe, she retreated to her room. Sleep eluded her, and she found herself standing at the window, staring out at the moonlit landscape. A soft knock at her door startled her. Opening it, she found Hank standing in the hallway, his expression troubled. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said quietly. "But I couldn't sleep knowing you were worried." Kate stepped back, inviting him in without words. It was improper. But propriety seemed a small concern given the circumstances. Hank remained near the door, keeping a respectful distance. "I've been thinking about your situation. There may be a way—" He hesitated, then continued. "In some territories, a woman can file for divorce on grounds of cruelty. It's not easy, and it takes time, but it's possible." Kate smiled sadly. Even if that were true, Vernon would never allow it. He would contest it, bring witnesses to testify to his good character and my supposed instability. "Then we'll find another way," Hank said stubbornly. Kate studied his face in the dim light filtering through the window. "Why are you doing this, Hank? Why risk yourself for me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady. "Because from the moment I saw you, something in me recognized something in you. Because I can't stand by and watch you suffer when I have the power to help. Because—" He took a deep breath. "Because I'm falling in love with you, Kate. And I know it's too soon. And you have every reason to distrust a man's words. But it's the truth." Kate felt tears spring to her eyes. "Hank." "You don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know that you're not alone in this." "I think," Kate said carefully, her voice trembling slightly, "that I might be falling in love with you too. And it terrifies me." Hank took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I would never hurt you, Kate. Not ever." "I believe you," she whispered and realized it was true. Somehow, against all odds and experience, she trusted this man. He reached out slowly, his fingertips brushing against her cheek where the bruise had been. "You don't have to hide from me," he said softly. "Not your past, not your pain, not your fears. I see you, Kate, all of you. And you're the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known." Kate closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. For the first time in years, she felt safe, cherished, seen. The moment was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard below. Many hoofbeats, approaching fast. Hank moved to the window, his body tensing. "Riders, 6 of them." He turned back to Kate, his expression grim. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me." Fear surged through her. "Hank." "I won't let him take you," Hank promised, his voice fierce. "Trust me." He slipped out of the room and Kate locked the door as instructed, her heart pounding. She pressed her ear against the wood, straining to hear what was happening. Voices from below, raised in anger, Maxwell's gruff tones. And then, cutting through the others, a voice she would know anywhere, cultured, commanding, and cold as ice. "Vernon." Kate backed away from the door, panic threatening to overwhelm her. He had found her. He was here, and he would take her back. And this time, there would be no escape. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs galvanized her. Kate looked around desperately for a weapon, any means of defending herself. The window, but it was too high to jump safely. She was trapped. The doorknob rattled. "Katherine," Vernon called, his voice deceptively gentle. "I know you're in there, my dear. Open the door. It's time to come home." Kate pressed herself against the far wall, shaking her head though he couldn't see her. "Go away, Vernon." "Now, Katherine, don't be difficult. You're unwell. Everyone understands that. No one blames you for your confusion. But you need to come home where I can care for you properly." "I'm not confused," Kate said, her voice stronger than she felt. "And I'm never coming back to you. Never." There was a pause, and when Vernon spoke again, the false gentleness was gone from his voice. "Open this door immediately, Katherine, or I will break it down. And I promise you, we'll regret making a scene." Kate closed her eyes, terror and despair washing over her in equal measure. Then came the sound of a scuffle, a thud, and Vernon's voice raised in anger. "Unhand me. Do you know who I am? I have the law on my side." "Not here, you don't," came Hank's steady reply. "Not when it comes to hurting women." More sounds of struggle, and then Maxwell's voice. "Take him downstairs, boys. We'll let the sheriff sort this out when he arrives." A moment later, there was a soft knock at the door. "Kate, it's me. Open up." Kate fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking so badly she could hardly manage it. When the door finally swung open, Hank stood there, his hair disheveled and a cut on his cheekbone, but otherwise unharmed. "You're safe," he said simply. "He can't hurt you anymore." Kate stared at him in disbelief. "How?" "Maxwell sent for the sheriff before the riders ever arrived. Turns out your husband hired some locals to help him retrieve you, but they weren't expecting us to be ready for them." Hank's expression was grim but satisfied. And Vernon made a crucial mistake. He struck one of our men in front of witnesses, including the sheriff, who just rode up. That, combined with your testimony about his previous abuse. "Will it be enough?" Kate asked, hardly daring to hope. "He's a powerful man." "Not here," Hank said again. "Not in this territory, where we judge a man by his actions, not his money or position." He held out his hand to her. "Come downstairs. The sheriff wants to speak with you." Kate placed her hand in his, drawing strength from his steady presence as they descended to the main room. Vernon was there, flanked by two of Maxwell's cowhands, his fine Eastern suit dusty and torn, his face contorted with fury. "Katherine!" he spat when he saw her. "This is how you repay me? By consorting with this cowboy? Have you no shame?" Kate flinched at his tone but stood her ground. "The only shame was in staying with you as long as I did, Vernon." Sheriff Taylor, a weathered man with keen eyes, stepped forward. "Mrs. Miller, I understand from Mr. Whitaker and Mr. Maxwell that your husband has a history of physically abusing you. Is that correct?" Kate took a deep breath. "Yes, Sheriff. For nearly 2 years." Vernon laughed harshly. "She's delusional. Ask anyone in Boston. My wife has episodes of hysteria." "Quiet," the sheriff snapped. "I'm not asking you." He turned back to Kate. "Can you show me any evidence of this abuse?" Kate hesitated, then slowly rolled up her sleeve to reveal the fading yellow bruises on her upper arm. "These are from the last time, the night I ran. There are more." She touched her cheek where the bruise had been. "I tried to hide them with powder." The sheriff nodded gravely. I've seen enough. He turned to Vernon. Mr. Miller, you're under arrest for assault. We take that sort of thing seriously out here. Vernon's face paled with shock, then flushed with rage. This is absurd. She is my wife. I have the right. You have no right to hurt her, the sheriff interrupted coldly. Wife or not, that's not how we do things in this territory. As the sheriff led Vernon away, the man turned back, his eyes burning with hatred. This isn't over, Katherine. You belong to me. Always. Kate felt Hank's arm slip around her shoulders, steadying her. You don't belong to anyone but yourself, he said quietly. And you never will again. The following days were a blur of legal proceedings. Vernon, unused to a place where his money and connections held little sway, found himself facing serious charges. The sheriff, disgusted by the evidence of abuse, had telegraphed the territorial judge, who agreed to hear the case immediately. Kate, with Hank by her side, testified to the years of abuse. Mrs. Rhodes corroborated her story, describing Kate's condition when she first arrived in Redemption Creek. And to Kate's astonishment, a letter arrived from her former housekeeper in Boston, who had witnessed Vernon's cruelty firsthand and, upon hearing of the proceedings through a friend in the telegraph office, had bravely offered her own testimony. In the end, the judge not only sentenced Vernon to 6 months in the territorial prison for assault, but granted Kate's petition for divorce, a rare decision, but one the judge felt was justified by the circumstances. The bonds of matrimony are sacred, the judge declared, but they are not chains to bind a woman to cruelty and violence. This court finds that Mr. Miller has forfeited his rights as a husband through his unconscionable actions. Vernon was led away, still protesting, still threatening, but his words held no power over Kate anymore. For the first time in years, she was truly free. Standing outside the courthouse in the bright Arizona sunshine, Kate felt lightheaded with relief. I can hardly believe it, she said to Hank, who had not left her side throughout the ordeal. Believe it, he said, smiling down at her. You're free, Kate. Free to make your own choices, go where you want, be who you want. She looked up at him, this man who had stood by her, who had believed in her when no one else did. What if what I want is to stay here, with you? Hank's eyes softened. Then I would be the happiest man in the territory. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing her cheek. No more hiding, Kate. Not your bruises, not your heart, not your dreams. No more hiding, she agreed, leaning into his touch. And when he lowered his head to kiss her, Kate rose to meet him, stepping into the light of a new beginning, unafraid at last to be seen. 6 months later, on a clear autumn day with the mountains turning gold and crimson in the distance, Katherine Miller became Hank Whitaker in a simple ceremony at the Redemption Creek Church. Mrs. Rhodes wept openly, Maxwell gave the bride away with gruff affection, and even the sheriff attended, tipping his hat respectfully to the couple. Hank had used his savings to purchase a small spread adjacent to the Rocking M, where they would build their own ranch and their own life. As they rode toward their new home after the ceremony, Kate leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she had never thought possible. Happy? Hank asked softly. Kate smiled up at him, her face open and unguarded in the late afternoon light. More than I ever dreamed I could be. And as they crossed the threshold of their cabin, hand in hand and hearts aligned, Kate knew that she had found not just safety, but true love, a love built on respect, trust, and the courage to be seen for exactly who she was.